Welcome to News from Neptune for the ultimate week of 2018, the last week. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them at all. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism. Close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialists made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and in China, for example. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a stocking up edition of News from Neptune, reference to the gyrations in the stock market this last week, and also to Christmas celebrations. Number of topics. You want to start, David?
Okay. I kind of went down into the rabbit hole of the debate regarding identity politics this week. So you might have to indulge me for just a couple of minutes here.
Sure.
It involves the usual suspects, by and large, and the center of a lot of criticism tends to be Adolph Reed, a man who I think knows as much about the relationship between race and class, the history of quote-unquote race politics in this country, and someone who I rely on to tell us what is happening. And the difference that I see between Reed and his critics is that he tends to talk about what is happening, and his critics tend to talk in very abstract terms. That aside, let me just quote a few things from an article that he wrote a couple of days ago on Common Dreams, that ended up on, strangely, on Common Dreams, a website that I definitely associate with identity politics, but good for them to publish this. This article was in response to an article in the New Republic, that is the New Republic, that was sold 2 or 3 years ago, or several years ago, however long that was, by a guy named Miguel Salazar, who I won't refer to very much, but just who is at the middle of this conflict, as are the usual suspects, including a fellow named Michael Yates, who is the book editor of the monthly review of the Marxist monthly, the venerable Marxist journal, the monthly review. In any event, Adolph Reed writes the following: the Democratic Socialists of America are openly debating internal tensions regarding identity and class. But there are important lessons the broader left needs to learn. If Trump too is to be defeated, the learning needs to come fast. Then it refers to an essay by Salazar, Do America's Socialists Have a Race Problem? This goes back to debates about the Sanders campaign and so forth, and the DSA, and how race and class are related to each other, not to mention gender and other issues. Reed goes on, DSA, as a result of the energies unleashed around the Bernie Sanders campaign in the 2016 election, has experienced such massive growth as to have become essentially a new organization. And the current controversy within the organization condenses a larger challenge facing the left in the United States as we confront the lessons of the victory of Trumpism and the need to struggle to contain, to defeat it. The debate within DSA sharpens the tensions and contradictions around defining strategies for charting a way forward in that larger struggle. Those tensions resolve down to two basic alternatives: a strategy focused centrally on agitating for social democratic programs, such as Medicare for all, free public higher education, public investment in physical and social infrastructure, intended to appeal broadly to working people of all races, genders, and sexual orientations, and one that rejects that focus, and, in contrast, one that rejects that focus in favor of efforts to mobilize around issues purported to reflect concerns of groups marginalized on the basis of race, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender, or other categories of ascribed identity. Within DSA, the debate is anchored, at least in principle, to the longer-term goal of social transformation along socialist lines. In that context, the first alternative, the class alternative, the first alternative is rooted in a long-standing conventional approach on mass movement building. The second, the identity politics, proceeds from a conviction that because of the overwhelming power of white supremacy and related systems of oppression in the United States, the route to socialism must give priority to challenging those hierarchies. This view rests on a determinist account that construes racism, commitment to white male heteronormative supremacy, as the driving imperative in American political history, and a corollary contention that that commitment has vitiated all progressive initiatives in the past and will continue to do so. Therefore, albeit incongruously in light of the determinism it posits, this approach insists that defeating that imperative is a necessary precursor to pursuit of any more general leftist agendas. Thus, I and others argue that its guiding perspective is race reductionist. Excuse me. One means through which Salazar seeks to validate that second identitarian alternative entails repeating a familiar line of attack, and here's going to get into some name dropping, a familiar line of attack on Melissa Naschek's critical review in Jacobin of Assad Haider's book, Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. This Melissa Naschek was critical of this book of Assad Haider, who is a leftist, but who made rather a brief for identity politics in this book. And because her review has become a flashpoint for attacks from identitarians in DSA and elsewhere, it is worth considering what she actually argues. And just one more paragraph. Naschek's judgment, correct in my view, is that Haider's book fails because of the shakiness, because of, quote, from Naschek, the shakiness of his historical narrative, end quote, and, quote, the shop-worn account of the failure of the civil rights movement to provide an institutional pathway out of poverty, causing the emergence of black nationalist ideology in response, end quote. In part, because of this inadequate reading of history, she argues, and Reed agrees with her on this, Haider, in asserting that, quote, black self-determination and socialism are mutually dependent. That's a pretty awesome statement in a bad way. Black self-determination and socialism are mutually dependent, Haider argued in his book, embraces a do both, quote unquote, approach to movement building that enables, quote, powerful enemies of the left and allies of capital to worm their way into our coalition and play up identity to reshape working class demands until they are neutralized. I know that's a lot to take in if you haven't familiar with this, familiar with the names and faces of this, made even more confusing because Assad Haider edits a Marxist journal or website called Viewpoint and does some good work there. But I agree with this Melissa Naschek and with Reed's support of her in regard to their approach towards understanding what the nature of the civil rights movement was, what the nature of the Black Power movement was, which Reed is highly critical of because he feels that Black Power devolved into a form of identity politics, which he, I think, is right about that, largely right about that. And so we go from here, and these very much reflect the on the ground. I think his summary of the DSA could as well be put within the context of the larger Democratic Party, how these debates about identity and class play out, whether in the context of the Sanders campaign or whether in the context of the terrain, which is more explicitly leftist and socialist than Bernie Sanders.
You're watching News from Neptune. We'll put that article and this discussion that David just offered on the website, on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where this program also will be posted, thanks to the technical expertise of the staff here at UPTV. I have a short and brutal summary to offer to you, David.
Yes. I love brutality.
I have said for
as
a while.
As long as it's verbal.
Well, there's a lot of brutality going on in this
Yeah.
matter, so it's worthwhile perhaps to think about it this way.
Yeah.
I've said for a while that identity politics, as it bedevils us today, is a result of the massive failure of nerve by American liberals in the 1970s. And it's necessary, I think, to get the overall structure of the argument, because the failure of nerve by Democrats and other liberals in America in the 1970s amounted to an abandonment of the tradition of the New Deal. The New Deal, which arose in the last Great Depression in the U.S., was an attempt to not transform capitalism into socialism or something more human and humane, but to take the rough edges off capitalism, to ameliorate the brutality that was visited on the majority of the population in the Great Depression as a direct result of American capitalism. The New Deal tried to deal with this matter by putting in ameliorations of the capitalist order, not changing it fundamentally, providing things like Social Security, workmen's compensation, various forms of social support that would ease the suffering of American workers. The problem was the exploitation of American workers, which is endemic to the capitalist order. And the New Deal said we can take the rough edges off that. We can make things a little smoother, a little more comfortable for the majority of the population. That's the attitude and the approach that characterized American liberalism from the 1930s to the early 1970s. But then something happened in the early 1970s, partially as a result of the political consciousness raised by the anti-Vietnam War movement and the fear of the American business classes that the New Deal tradition of amelioration would go too far. Would hurt the position of American capitalism. And as a counterattack on the New Deal, the American capitalism came up with a series of programs that tried to increase the exploitation of the American worker by ending those ameliorations that the New Deal had brought in. The great crisis was not that. That was perfectly understandable. The great crisis was the failure of American liberals at that point to challenge this counterattack from American business. Instead of reasserting the New Deal approach and perhaps even a further attack on the exploitation endemic to capitalism. Instead of doing that, the liberals said, oh, gee, we'll cave in. We'll let American business reestablish the control that it had 2 generations ago, and indeed increase it. And that makes us feel bad, but we'll give in. That was the American liberal position, and a certain bad conscience among American liberals said, well, gee, if we're not going to stand against exploitation, if we're not going to stand up for the American working class, let's look around and find some other some other group that is suffering and work for them. And the civil rights movement at that time gave them an example. They said, look, there are people who are hurting in American society, not because of exploitation, that in fact was the reason, but they said, let's ignore exploitation, let's ignore the situation of the working class, and instead let's find somebody else that we can champion, someone else we can stand up for. Let's shift our concerns from exploitation to discrimination. People who are left out one way or another, people who are marginally discriminated against, whom we can champion. Black people were the first candidates, in part because of the civil rights movement, but there were others. Other discriminated groups, including women and various and sundry sexual minorities and so forth, all of whom stepped up for the liberals' concern about discrimination. The great transition amongst liberals from being concerned with exploitation and the working class to discrimination and those various groups that proclaimed their identities in the way David described, that was the contribution, or that was the great failure of American liberalism in the 1970s. And about more than a generation later, we're playing that out today. Identity politics is a result of the great refusal by American liberals in the 1970s, and the problem is by no means going away.
Yeah, and part of this debate, you refer to the New Deal. Part of this debate is how we understand how race played out, how considerations of obviously the Southern segregated society at that time played out in relation to the implementation of the New Deal. I have a little more research to do, a couple of long articles to read about that, but there has been debate and a sort of revisionist, in a good sense and in a bad sense, history of the role of race during the New Deal, which even came up in Clinton's criticism, as Hillary Clinton's criticism of Bernie Sanders during the 2016 campaign, during the primary campaign. So these are a little bit complicated issues, but again, what you've got is people who identify as Marxists, or certainly socialists and leftists, like Michael Yates, like Louis Project, who are trying to foist this idea that support identity politics in terms of their criticism of what was good and not so good about the New Deal in relation to race. One more thing, just to bring up to the 1980s, and this is typical of the kind of thing that Adolf Reed has become known for, a harsh criticism of what Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon at Black Agenda Report call the Black misleadership class. Reed has been up to this since, at least he's about my age, so he's close to 70, and he's been doing this in his academic career at least since the 1980s, or perhaps earlier. But in the 1990s, in 1995, he wrote the following, just as an example of his contrarian view about black politics and black power. He talked about the Jesse Jackson campaign of 1984 for president. In this regard, Jackson's campaign may well have strengthened the party's, that means the Democratic Party's, rightist faction, meaning the emerging faction that would eventually become the Clinton movement and the Democratic Leadership Council movement. in the aftermath of Mondale's defeat in 1984. Reed goes on, the two Jackson campaigns, 84 and 88, were arguably purely beneficial for the Democratic right. Jackson's insurgency maximized black visibility, yet posed no genuine threat pragmatically, because at the same time it demobilized blacks' participation in the debate over the party's future substantively and strategically. It demobilized black Democrats substantively by defining their interests solely in relation to Jackson's personal fortunes, and strategically by funneling black action through his insider style of brokerage politics. By 1992, the rightist narrative had become nearly hegemonic in the Democratic Party and in the society at large, thanks principally to its continual, virtually unchallenged repetition as fact by sympathetic journalists and academics. So that's just one example of Adolph Reed's long-term criticism of black power, not just of black power and black nationalism, but of sort of black insider politics, which we come to know, identify today most in terms of the internet with the black agenda report, Glenn Ford, Bruce Dixon, and other people who write for that.
Naturally, there are good reasons to be opposed to discrimination in the society, and it's a general principle that one is against discrimination as one is against violence or other things that do wrong to people in the society. But the problem is that American liberalism has substituted a good thing, opposition to discrimination, for what they should be doing, opposing exploitation, opposing capitalism. And therefore identity politics takes the place of agitating for Medicare for all, a universal basic income, other possibilities that don't refer to special groups who are being discriminated against. It refers to all people who work for a living in the United States. This is the subterranean battle that's going on, or the basic battle that's going on in American politics today, and we can see it emerge occasionally. As David has referenced the last presidential campaign, but it's clearer now, that Trump was the first major party presidential candidate in 40 years, and so in other words, since the rise of identity politics and neoliberalism. Trump was the first candidate in those years actually to attack the principles of neoliberalism, to attack the principles of the business response to the 60s that insisted upon market fundamentalism and the reassertion of the rights of capital. Trump attacked that. And people heard his attacks. And in response, Hillary Clinton condemned those people as deplorables, as racists, as folks who were not taking discrimination seriously, as she insisted she was. That was the undercurrent, and the important undercurrent, of the last presidential election. Identity politics, in other words, was the banner of the Democrats and opposition to neoliberalism, which was turned into opposition to identity politics, was the banner of the Trump campaign. In those circumstances, we need to shift our attention back to the actual economic situation of a majority of Americans today. Events seem to be doing that for us. This last week, we've had wild gyrations in the stock market that set records in terms of ups and downs in that market. Now, the stock market is not the American economy, but they are bound up together. And it's interesting to see what the connection actually is. It was actually well set out by Richard Wolff, the economist, on Democracy Now! This week. We've had critical things to say about Democracy Now! Recently, and they were, of course, entirely justified. But the fact of the matter is that Democracy Now! Is putting on people like Wolff, saying serious things about the questions we're talking about today. Wolff said this week, and this is important, I think, the capitalist system has a downturn every 4 to 7 years. It's had that for centuries. And the last big downturn was 2008 and 2009. So if you do 4 and 7 and you add it to 9, we're due for one. And every major stock market observer, every bank and so on, predicts that we're having a downturn. We're getting a downturn. So it's really only a question of exactly when. And the stock market anticipates this. And so we're having, in a way, economic chickens coming home to roost. And the notion that it's just the Federal Reserve's policy that explains this is really the kind of remark that would get a student a very low grade in any economics course. Richard Wolff was a professor of economics for many years. It is also the source of the populism that made Trump president and hasn't gone away. The American voters understood what had happened to them in the previous generation and had grown disaffected with the notion that the Democrats would bring hope and change. They didn't see any hope and they didn't see any change. But this attitude had to be excoriated as racism on the part of the Democratic candidate when it was really about the life conditions of the majority of the electorate. Wolff goes on. We have a lot of employment. The Democrats keep saying, the unemployment rate was low. We have a lot of employment, but the quality of the jobs has collapsed over the last 10 years. The people who work now used to be people who had a job with good income, good benefits, and good security. Many of this a result of the New Deal reforms, of course. The jobs overwhelmingly the jobs that have been created have none of those things. Low wages, that's why our wages have gone nowhere. Wages in the United States have been essentially flat since the 1970s, since the circumstances that produced identity politics. Bad benefits, those are shrinking, pensions and so on, and the security of employment is virtually gone. One of our biggest problems in America is people don't know 1 week to the next what hours they're working, what income they'll get. You can't have a life like this. And of course, this is truest for people who are entering the workforce. It is even more true for people who are entering the workforce. Wolff continues, so what we've done is we've ratcheted down the quality of jobs. We've made people use up their savings since the great crash of 2008, so they're in a bind. They have really no choice but to offer themselves at lower wages or at less benefits or at less security than before, which is why there's the anger, which is why there was the vote for Mr. Trump in the first place. Because this talk of recovery really is about the stock market with the funny money that the Federal Reserve pumped in. And it's not about the real lives of people, which are in serious trouble. Hence the numbers. For example, an average American family can't pay a $400 emergency cost because it doesn't have that kind of money in the background, in savings or in credit. The average American, that's true for half the American, for the median American family. So you've undone the underlying economy, you have this frothy stock market for the 1%, and this is an impossible tension tearing the country apart, close quote. Now, I think that's exactly right. I think Richard Wolff is speaking obvious sense there against the liberal economic establishment represented by people like Paul Krugman. And Democracy Now!, to its credit, has Mr. Wolff on the television telling the truth about the matter. But that's what we're dealing with. That's what produced Trump. That's what produced, by the way, parallel movements producing things like the populist upsurges in Britain and France and elsewhere right now. And it's a problem that's not going to go away. It's the political problem of the day, and it's bound up, by the way, with questions of war. because the American ruling class has, for more than a century, known that if it really is in serious trouble with the American populace, it can always find a foreign enemy and promote a war, as it did in 1914 and 1941, and use that as the basis for checking the American populist demand for a New Deal.
Back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you had a Democrat head of the Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker, whose job was to strangle the economy, to raise interest rates enough to slow down the economy, to crush the high inflation of that era. And ever since then, the policy of the United States government and the ruling class, as reflected in the Federal Reserve policies, has been to be much more concerned about lowering inflation rather than putting people to work and raising their wages to the point where they can share in the productivity gains that their work was affording the society, and that is what has been happening ever since. So what happens, if I understand this sort of psychology, the ruling class, the unemployment gets to a certain point, and the ruling class starts to worry that employees, because there are more of them working and not as many of them out of work, are going to be able to demand higher wages. But higher wages will cut into profits, and higher wages will spur inflation that decreases the wealth of those people that have wealth. So therefore, the Federal Reserve, as a tool of the ruling class, goes along with that and begins to raise rates. And Donald Trump, and everyone from Donald Trump to Dean Baker, the kind of prominent Keynesian economist, decry the pressure on the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to slow down the economy and to put people out of work so as to preserve wealth. And so this is the conundrum that capitalism finds itself in, has always, to a certain extent, found itself in.
Our omniscient researcher, J.B. Nicholson, has provided a remarkable video about wealth inequality in America. That video will be linked on our Facebook page, and you can watch it there. It was about a half hour. Of graphical representations of wealth inequality in America. We have to realize that wealth inequality in America has not only grown rapidly in the 40 years of neoliberalism and identity politics. Wealth inequality, which, remember, was supposed to go away once we took care of discrimination. Wealth inequality has not only grown rapidly in that time, it's grown at an accelerated rate. That's been the result of the great refusal of the Democrats in the 1970s to maintain the tradition of the New Deal. And you can watch this video on our Facebook page that our researcher J.B. Nicholson has found. And the situation is recognizable to most Americans because they know what's happened to their wealth in the last generation. They know what's happened to their life chances in comparison to those of their parents. But we don't talk about that. That's impolite. We deal with questions of discrimination, not questions of the fortunes, the real fortunes of the American working class. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a good number of things to talk about yet, and time is running short. You're next, David, if you'd like.
Well, I just reiterate, just to sort of round out the points I've been trying to make. There was an article on. I brought too many papers here today. Did you read Dylan Riley's article on the New Left Review about what is Trump by any chance?
I didn't. I haven't read that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll put that on the Facebook page too. This is the current New Left Review.
And then there's, again, this sort of gets back to the debate. Richard Seymour, the British leftist, seems to increasingly find himself invoked on the more or less identity politics side of these things. And whereas Dylan Riley, the Berkeley sociologist, very good sociologist, wrote a brief for some of the arguments we've been making on this program. Basically, Trump isn't a fascist and Trump is weak.
Yes.
And Richard Seymour responded to that in a kind of curious way on his Patreon blog, which I would just like to at least refer to, just to elaborate on some more. What it seems to me that this central debate on the left plays itself out in all kinds of ways in relationship to identity politics. We've been talking about this all year long, so since it's our last program. These fissures, if you want to call them that, have played themselves out in the context of Syria, in the context of the so-called red-brown alliance, and whether or not people on the left should get along with people on the right about things about values that they share or programs that they share. It's played itself out in terms of this business of fascism and authoritarianism and what is Trump, what isn't Trump. So all these things are going along with the identity politics. I think they all relate to each other in various ways. Oh, there's the other one that popped up for a while in relation to Max Blumenthal and this whole bipolarity issue, whether you can be a bipolarist or you have to be a unipolarist. I know this might sound strange to our listeners who probably don't follow this stuff as closely as I do, but you see the same characters popping up pretty much. I mean, sometimes there's people shifting around from one side, but it's pretty much people taking, in the era of Trump, people going on one side or the other of these issues. Almost all who claim to oppose Trump, but analyze it in different ways and oppose it in different ways.
I think we should be North Polists last week, right? And South Polists this week?
Yeah.
Didn't the guy just walk across the South Pole and make a big deal of it? That's whatever poll you happen to be interested in. And indeed, the polls that show what people are actually interested in have been very interesting from France and Britain recently. But they're also interesting on another topic that probably we should spend some time on today, and that is war. That is quite remarkable circumstances in Washington that has the president calling for a withdrawal of American troops from Syria and to some extent from Afghanistan, and being strongly resisted by both left and right. I've contended for a while it makes no sense. It makes little sense to talk much about left and right in American politics these days. But the American political establishment, both left and right, if you consider those descriptions of the Republicans and Democrats, say, the American political establishment is appalled at Trump's attempt to do what he said he was going to do in the campaign, that is, liquidate some of the American foreign wars, a proposal that by the poll results suggests garnered him a significant number of votes. It's one of the reasons Trump is president. But instead of the evaluation of the wretched war policy of the United States from our mainstream media, we get evaluations of Trump's mental state and the Trump derangement syndrome that leads people to say, well, we don't really need to talk about the politics of the American government, or the policies of the American government, but rather about whether President Trump is an egomaniac or not. This is a wonderful distraction, and the distraction that the American political establishment is using to get away from the very real and worthwhile proposals made in the campaign, however bombastically, by Donald Trump that he seems to a remarkable extent to be acting on now. It involves our particular program here in an interesting way. We've said for years that our program is an homage to Noam Chomsky, the most interesting, I think, political writer of his generation. Chomsky turned 90 this month, and remarkably enough, he is still saying important things that should be attended to. Much has been made of the fact that Chomsky says, it's been said that Chomsky opposes Trump's withdrawal of American troops from Syria because it will expose the Kurds, and the word is used variously because there are different groups of Kurds, but specifically the Kurds of Rojava, the northern section of Syria, to Turkish depredations. That's true. And Chomsky has said, and has been saying for a while, that the Kurds, who are seriously oppressed by Turkey within Turkey and also on Turkey's borders, need support from the United States in order to maintain themselves against the Turks. That's right. And the U.S. also used the Kurds against ISIS. They used the military capabilities of the Rojava Kurds against the Islamic State group. The U.S. government relation to the Islamic State group is at best complex. There are many ways in which the U.S. essentially supported the Islamic State and was present at the creation of the Islamic State. So for them suddenly to say that, well, of course, we need to destroy the Islamic State raises some interesting contradictions in American policy. But the question of the Kurds was a serious one. Are the Kurds going to be allowed to be submitted to the tender mercies of the Turks, or are they going to be supported by the United States, which used them against the jihadists that the American government sent into Syria in the first place? In the news yesterday, we learned that the Syrian government, the Damascus government, the Syrian government forces and those of its Russian allies, the Russians being in Syria at the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria, had reinforced the area around Manbij. Manbij is at the center of the Kurdish region of northern Syria, against the possibility of the Kurds there being attacked by Turkey. The American withdrawal, in other words, is not the great threat, apparently, to the Kurds, because the Kurds have reconciled to, these particular Kurds had reconciled to some extent with the Damascus government and had the support of the Syrian Arab Army, the Syrian military, and the Russians. A complex story that's not being well told, not surprisingly, by the American media, but the ongoing withdrawal of American forces from the killing they've been doing in the Middle East cannot be a bad thing, and the notion that this would somehow expose the Kurds to depredations from Turkey seems, at the moment at least, to be set aside. It's a question we should watch and pay more attention to, and it's not, to your surprise, being well presented by the American media.
Yeah, I heard the latest podcast that Rania Khalek does, and she's been based in Lebanon for the last year or so, and follows these situations pretty closely. And I think that her view was speculative for sure, but she is not optimistic about the fate of the Kurds subsequent to U.S. withdrawal in relation to the Turks. She just sort of feels like it might quote unquote destabilize. I mean, it sounds like a strange thing for her to be saying. She's in favor of the U.S. withdrawing from Syria and from the region, and she's taken a lot of heat and called Assadist thousands of times by those who are more concerned about overthrowing that government. But still, she doesn't have the sense that that things will get. I think she has the sense that things will get worse before they get better, subject to a U.S. withdrawal. But I think you're right in saying this needs to be kept a close eye on. And obviously, in a situation like this, I mean, when you have a view like someone like Chomsky, who is concerned about their well-being, and on the other hand, you have people that are so anti-Assadist that they hate the Kurds too, because they hate the U.S. for not overthrowing Assad, and they're just saying, "Screw you, Kurds."
Although,
it's a very strange thing.
And Chomsky begins with the notion that the Kurds are caught between what he refers to as the murderous Assad government, and it unfortunately has many reasons for being called that, and the vicious Turkish oppression of the Kurds both within Turkey and on the border. So the original suggestion back in October by Chomsky and others that the U.S. presence in Rojava in the Kurdish areas of northern Syria was necessary to prevent the murder of the Kurds by the Turks across the border. What's happened now is that that Rojava movement, which is an interesting progressive movement in itself, feminist and otherwise, as has been pointed out, that Rojava Kurdish movement has reconciled to some extent, apparently, under pressure, obviously, with the Damascus government, and the Damascus government is going to take responsibility, along with its important Russian allies, to keep the Turks from destroying Rojava. So the situation is certainly serious and dangerous, but the immediate assumption that an American withdrawal means the destruction of Rojava seems not to be the case. There's a second point here about the American withdrawal from Syria and perhaps from Afghanistan that I've seen very little comment about in the American media. It's universally thought on what we call the left and right that this withdrawal is a whim of Trump and of Trump's, and the Trump derangement syndrome seems to be affecting the accounts of the proposals for withdrawal that we get from left and right, as we say in the American press. One notable example comes from Gareth Porter, who has been writing on these matters for a long time. He insists that Trump's Syria withdrawal decision was not mere impulse. Mattis and Dunford, Mattis being the defense secretary and Dunford being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mattis and Dunford had been refusing for months to give Trump any timelines for gradual withdrawal, to manipulate him to accept an indefinite deployment, and it finally backfired. This is important. The internal fights within the American government are quite serious, and they take up the notion of the weakness of Donald Trump as president and the machinations of the permanent government, both within the administration and in the political structure outside the administration. I'll take a minute to talk about Gareth Porter's article because it's I think, both accurate and practically unique. The mainstream media has attacked President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria as impulsive, blindsiding his own national security team. But detailed published accounts of the policy process over the course of the year tell a very different story. They show that senior national security officials and self-interested institutions, read the military, have been playing a complicated political game for months aimed at keeping Trump from wavering on our indefinite presence on the ground in Syria. The entire episode thus represents a new variant of a familiar pattern dating back to Vietnam, in which national security advisors put pressure on reluctant presidents to go along with existing or proposed military deployments in a war zone. Parentheses here, for those of us old enough to remember, this may have something to do with Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal and refusal to run again for president. The difference here is that Trump, by publicly choosing a different policy, has blown up their transparent schemes of the military and the permanent government and offered the country a new course, one that does not involve a permanent war state. The relationship between Trump and his national security, just to mention on that, and what we get, if that's reported at all, is the notion that, Trump is Putin's puppet and he's just doing what Putin tells him to do. This is nonsense. The relationship between Trump and his national security team has been tense since the beginning of the administration. By midsummer 2017, Defense Secretary James Mattis and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Joseph Dunford had become so alarmed at Trump's negative responses to their briefings justifying global U.S. military deployments that they decided to do a formal briefing in the tank used by the Joint Chiefs for meetings in the Pentagon. This was basically a meeting of the American military establishment trying to decide how to counter the announced policies and goals of an elected president. But when Mattis and Dunford sang the praises of the, quote, rules-based international democratic order that has kept the peace for 70 years, yada, 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 close quote, what we've heard for all along by the American military and the pro-war establishment, Trump simply shook his head in disbelief. By the end of that year, however, Mattis, Dunford, and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, believed they'd succeeded in getting Trump to use U.S. troops not only to defeat Islamic State, but to, quote, stabilize, close quote, the entire northeast sector of Syria and balance Russia and Iranian-sponsored forces. All of this takes place in the context of American foreign policy, which is remarkably unchanging. Yet they ignored warning signs of Trump's continuing displeasure with their vision of a more or less permanent American military presence in Syria. In a March rally in Ohio ostensibly about health care reform, Trump suddenly blurted out, quote, we're coming out of Syria, like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon, we're coming out, close quote. Then in early April 2018, Trump's impatience with his advisors on Syria boiled over into a major confrontation in a National Security Council meeting where he ordered them unequivocally to accept a fundamentally different Syria deployment policy. Trump opened the meeting with his public stance that the United States must end its intervention in Syria and in the Middle East more broadly. He argued repeatedly that the U.S. had gotten nothing for its efforts, according to an account published by the Associated Press based on interviews with administration officials who had been briefed on the meeting. When Dunford, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, asked Trump to state exactly what he wanted, Trump answered that he favored an immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces and an end to the stabilization program in Syria. Stabilization is Pentagon speak for killing enough Syrians that they don't object to our being there. This went on for a while. This is the background to Trump's announcement of the withdrawal of American troops from Syria. The government admits to 2,000, it's probably more like 7,000, and a suggestion that a substantial number of troops were to be withdrawn from Afghanistan as well. Remember, Barack Obama was elected in 2008 on an assumed promise by the American people that the war in Afghanistan would be rolled up, would be liquidated, American troops would be coming out of Afghanistan. Well, he spent 2 presidential terms not doing what he had led people to believe that he would do as the election went on. This is a very different Donald Trump from the one that we're seeing in the almost universal depiction in the American media on both the left and the right, if you like. And it does suggest that the long-term concerns of American foreign policy, which led to 8 wars in Obama's time and ongoing war provocations, we shouldn't forget that, against Russia and China, from the South China Sea to Ukraine, that this ending this policy is in fact popular in the United States. We get all sorts of jingoistic declarations by American media figures, but the American public historically, not just in the last couple of years, but for a much longer time, has been a stumbling block to the attempts by the American government to use its military force for the benefit of the profits of the 1% around the world. We did a special program here on Pearl Harbor, pointing out the consensus now that Pearl Harbor was manipulated by the Roosevelt administration because the ongoing war in Europe was not supported by a majority of Americans who desperately wanted to remain outside the European war that was going on in 1941. It was only by getting the other side to strike first, a technique, by the way, that goes back to Fort Sumter and before, that an American government could convince the American populace that war was necessary. We get a very different picture of what's going on this war, on the war front in America in regard to what the administration and the permanent government of military and political figures are doing. And it's one we should pay a good deal more attention to. Final word?
The question would be, is given who Trump's advisors are now, John Bolton, et cetera, whether his strategies in the Middle East reflect the fact that he wants to ratchet things up against China.
And that is material for the next program. You've been watching News from Neptune.
You don't have a yes or no answer to that?
I don't have an answer, no answer to that. Sorry about that.
Okay.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the ultimate week, the last week of 2018, a stocking up edition after an erratic week in the stock market. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.